And next up we have Abduction Chronicles, Genesis, book number 1, written by Peter John. It is, 357 pages, $4.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited, and here's the author's description. Colonel Petros Arkansas, retired, is abducted from his comfortable home by aliens and his life changes forever. The aliens begin experiments on him with tests in harsh computer-generated environments and expect him to survive without modern equipment. The colonel teams up with a core group of spec op operatives to survive. But first, he has to learn what his new situation is, what enhancements he has available in these game-like simulations, and how to ramp them up. He begins a wild adventure of self-discovery, self-enhancement, and in some rare instances, self-awareness. Will he survive the unfamiliar idea of grinding out levels for enhancements, and who will come to his aid? The path he chooses is often dark, filled with fantastical creatures from outlandish beings, and the steps he takes are racked with pain and far less traveled. Along the way, he discovers that humanity's existence is on a knife's edge and the road to salvation lies in his hands. Together with the team, he has to face down some of the scariest horrors in existence. Despite all these obstacles, Petros digs deep into that dogged Spec Ops persona and meets the road he treads with a hard, determined step and a willingness to run. Will he run away or towards the challenges? So there we go. And the author describes it as a subtle combination of military, sci-fi, fantasy, gamelit, and LitRPG, and lots of action and intrigue for followers of any of these genres. So there you go. I don't know if it's subtle. Okay. The cover for this novel it just doesn't do it justice. It kind of highlights only one particular aspect, the military aspect. And it doesn't do it justice for the sci-fi adventure, the action adventure, the fantasy aspects, or the LitRPG gamelit aspects. So it just doesn't do it justice to what this actually is. So actually quite a bit of good writing. But if I was just judging this book by this cover, I don't know that I would have picked it up if this wasn't like something I did. So like I said, if you like any of those aspects after the review, definitely give it a chance. Don't judge this by a cover. In the foreword to the novel, the author definitely identifies 3 genres that the story uses: fantasy, LitRPG, and military fiction. And while it's true that the novel hits all 3 points, there's definitely priority for which is fleshed out the most and matters to the story. Unfortunately, the LitRPG sections are the least of the 3. The story starts off with the main character being abducted by aliens and injected with nanites that transform his potential. He finds himself dropped in simulations where he has to survive and reach some locations. This early part of the story is actually entertaining, even though there are game aspects to it with like notifications and stuff, and nav notifications. There is no early RPG aspects. That comes a little bit later. But that first survival section is actually really entertaining and kind of shows off one of the highlights of the story, in that there's this military survivalist aspect to the story that's just like really well written. And I from the first few pages after the abduction stuff is a little wonky. But once you get into the survival stuff, I was totally on board. And the first 12% of the novel focuses really on well-written survivalism, small doses of game-like notifications that are mostly used to convince the main character that he's in a simulation. After that 12% mark is where the RPG stuff comes into play, with the main character finally gaining levels, the ability to increase his stats and skills, and the ability to choose a class. From there, it's a really good bunch of world building as the main character comes to understand the situation he's in, why the aliens have abducted humans to fight for them, how to decide which side he's on, and if he's okay to work in the situation he's in. There's actually a lot of really interesting internal dialogue that the main character has with himself, which is why I kind of point this out, because it's like I said, a lot of this is really enjoyable. It's just the RPG stuff is not always among them, unfortunately. I'll get into that in a second. There's a lot of good training. There's magical and physical training, as well as clear threat the main character has to oppose. The biggest highlight of the story is definitely the military aspect. If you like military kind of science fiction, I think you'll enjoy this just based on that part alone. From the survival aspect to the camaraderie between the abducted military foreign personnel, there's just such rich detail that it's hard not to be impressed. The world building done to create the fantasy universe and the 2 main factions is rather well done too. There are lots of nice little details and fleshed out moments and stories that I think make it really believable this universe exists and these characters exist. However, this is where the novel kind of loses me a little bit. the story loses points with me because of the lit RPG aspects. The RPG elements in the context of the story, they're imposed by the abducting aliens as a way for humans to improve themselves. So basically, there is no inherent RPG system in this novel. It's not like he's transported to a fantasy RPG world or anything. He's really just abducted by aliens. He's injected with nanites, and those nanites have this inherent program where when he's dropped in the simulations, which are like these almost virtual reality simulations, if depending on what he's doing in the simulation and what he's doing to complete the quest line or the objective he's given, at the end of it, he earns experience points, and he can use those experience points to level up and to gain skills, and use, once he levels, use skill points and all the good stuff, right? However, there's an issue with that in that there's really no consistency for certain aspects of that RPG progression system. And that's kind of the thing that really threw me. Some are nicely designed, but some just feel like they don't matter at are just kind of arbitrary checkpoints for character growth. For example, the main character goes to the beginning simulation and he gets 5 levels for it at the very end of it. There's no details about, oh, you're getting so many experience points for killing this monster or for surviving this trap or for helping this player, and anything like that, right? There's an intentional lack of numbers there, and I think as somebody who's written LitRPG, who writes it, I absolutely understand that it's a total hassle to kind of track those numbers and to give them. But because of that, when at the end of the story, the main character is like, oh, he just gets a huge dump of like, oh, you've leveled, that feels less impactful because you don't know what he's getting experience points for, right? So it just feels like, oh, it's completely arbitrary. And that might be a part intentional, might really genuinely be part of the story, in that the aliens are in kind of arbitrarily giving experience and rewards depending on what they're trying to train the main character or the humans in, which is perfectly understandable. I absolutely get that, but it didn't make it feel like those levels were really impactful in the story, especially considering in other places in the story the main character goes through other simulations and they're less difficult, yet he gets more levels. He'll get 10 or 20 levels during those simulation sections. And sometimes he'll get rewards for things he's not doing in the simulation. Like he'll step out and he'll step back in. And then suddenly, at the end, he's getting 20 levels of experience. And I'm like, but beginning was really hard and he had to fight things and that was challenging. So I get that. But then later on seems super easy. Or at least less challenging, and he's getting even more experience. And I'm like, that my gamer brain and that's really what it felt like sometimes. And so it just kind of felt like the experience and levels are completely arbitrary, and not impactful. So that's what it meant for the leveling didn't really actually matter to this, right? It was kind of just this arbitrary marker that the main character was going to power up and increase his stats and get the surgery to increase those things. That's part of the story. And while that part was important because it actually had an actual impact on the story, the levels themselves just didn't feel as impactful. And again, that's my feelings about it. Not to say that that's the author's intention. The other aspects of progression felt more impactful. Like he said, if the other took out the leveling system, the actual numbers and levels, the story would kind of feel the same. The other aspects of progression felt more impactful. Like the main character would get skill increases as he practiced some skills, or he would get new skills as he learned them, and those felt more and more impactful. There is a magic system in the story, but it's completely fantasy based, so don't think of that as progression. The main character kind of wills spells into existence, or learns incantations and theories from books, but it's definitely not incorporated into the RPG system impactfully. There are ways for the main character to apply spell points to level up spell groups, but there didn't really seem to be an impact for that particular ship. It kind of felt like, oh, we should add this in and make sure he has spell points so that it makes sense. Overall, while the military and fantasy elements are well thought out and very impactful, some of the RPG stuff isn't. That's kind of where it lost me a little bit. I thought it was an entertaining story, lots of good action adventure. Like I said, the military stuff is like, this is on its own. The military action and camaraderie would get like an 8 out of 10 for me just by itself. However, the RPG stuff was just less satisfying for me because I come to these stories specifically for game mechanics, for the RPG stuff, right? And so for me, that part would get like a 6 out of 10. which is unfortunate. But overall, I'll kind of split the difference because, like I said, I really like some aspects of it, and some of it was not as enjoyable for me specifically. And I'll give it a 7.4 out of 10. So that's Abduction Chronicles. I had a good time with it, so it was always going to get a 7 at least. And I'm going to split it between the great military action stuff and the not amazing RPG stuff sometimes. And again, specifically because the levels feel like they weren't impactful for me. Now, the author read the review, and he kind of noted, he commented that he didn't feel like it was fair to get Dean for having light RPG mechanics, and so I want to make sure he's not getting like a deduction for having a light LitRPG mechanics. I like LitRPG in period. Whether they're light mechanics or they're crunchy or hard mechanical lost numbers, but specifically here it kind of lost me because the leveling felt like it didn't matter to the story. And for me, as somebody who loves game mechanics, who loves that part of LitRPG, a major mechanic not being impactful just lessened my enjoyment enough. So like I said, still had a good time with it. Overall, gets again a score of 7.4 out of 10 for Abduction Chronicles Genesis, book number 1, with a score of 7.4 out of 10.